Jess Rodriguez never expected serving champagne in a high-society engagement party would change her entire life. When the bride-to-be humiliated her in front of 50 wealthy guests, calling her, "Practice for serving at your own wedding, if anyone would ever want you," Jess thought it was just another cruel night at the country club. She had no idea the groom was watching from across the room, his jaw clenched with disgust at his fiancée's behavior. She couldn't have known that 3 days later, she'd find a 2-carat diamond ring in her tip jar, with a note that would shatter everything she thought she knew about love, money, and destiny. But the biggest shock was yet to come. Because the man who left that ring wasn't just any wealthy stranger. He was someone whose path had crossed hers long before that terrible night. And the reason he chose her would reveal a truth that would make the bride's cruelty seem like nothing compared to the betrayal that was about to unfold. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The crystal chandeliers of Westfield Country Club cast dancing shadows across the marble floors as Jess Rodriguez adjusted her black uniform for the 3rd time that evening. Her hands, still slightly damp from washing glasses in the kitchen, smoothed the fabric nervously as she surveyed the opulent ballroom filled with Charleston's elite. The engagement party of Victoria Ashworth and Alexander Bennett had drawn the city's most prominent families, their designer gowns and tailored suits creating a sea of understated wealth that made Jess feel like an intruder in her own workplace. At 26, Jess had been serving tables at various upscale venues for nearly 8 years, working her way through community college and now saving every penny for nursing school. Her dream of becoming a pediatric nurse felt both achingly close and impossibly far away, especially on nights like this when the cost of a single bottle of champagne could cover her rent for 2 months. She had learned to move through these gatherings like a ghost, efficient and invisible, her warm brown eyes taking in everything while revealing nothing of the thoughts that churned beneath her professional smile. The bride-to-be, Victoria Ashworth, stood at the center of the main reception area like a perfectly polished statue. Her platinum blonde hair was swept into an elaborate updo that had probably cost more than Jess made in a week, and her emerald green silk gown hugged her slender frame with the kind of precision that only came from custom tailoring. The massive emerald-cut diamond on her left hand caught the light with every gesture, sending sparkles across the faces of the admirers who surrounded her in an almost worshipful circle. Victoria's laugh, high and crystalline, rang out above the soft jazz music that drifted from the string quartet positioned near the windows overlooking the golf course. Jess had encountered Victoria before during previous events at the club, and each interaction had left her with an uncomfortable feeling in her stomach. There was something about the way Victoria looked at the serving staff, as if they were merely extensions of the furniture, that spoke to a deep-seated cruelty masked by breeding and social grace. Tonight, however, Victoria seemed particularly animated, her voice carrying across the room with an edge that made several staff members exchange worried glances. "This ring belonged to Alexander's great-grandmother," Victoria was saying to a cluster of women who hung on her every word. She was practically royalty in Charleston society. Of course, it needed to be reset entirely because the original setting was so terribly outdated, but the stone itself is flawless, 3 carats of perfection. She held her hand up to the light, admiring the way the diamond threw rainbows across the white tablecloth nearby. "Alexander insisted I have it, said I was the only woman worthy of wearing it." Across the room, Alexander Bennett stood with a group of men near the bar, his tall frame slightly hunched as if he were trying to make himself smaller. At 32, he possessed the kind of quiet, understated handsomeness that came from good genetics and careful grooming, but there was something in his posture that suggested discomfort with the attention his engagement had brought. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccably tailored, yet his green eyes held a distant quality as he nursed a glass of whiskey and offered polite nods to the congratulations flowing his way. Jess noticed how Alexander's gaze kept drifting toward Victoria, not with the adoration one might expect from a groom-to-be, but with something closer to resignation. There was a tightness around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions, though he maintained the polished facade expected of someone in his position. As the heir to Bennett Properties, one of the largest real estate development companies in the Southeast. Alexander had been groomed since childhood for a life that valued appearances and strategic alliances over money. Personal happiness. The evening progressed with the careful choreography of high society events. Waiters glided between guests with silver trays laden with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres, while conversations flowed in the practiced rhythm of people accustomed to performing their wealth. Jess moved efficiently through her assigned section, refilling glasses and clearing plates with the kind of practiced invisibility that came from years of service work. She had learned to read the subtle cues that distinguished a genuine thank you from polite dismissal, and tonight the room was heavy with the latter. As the evening wore on, Jess found herself assigned to the head table where Victoria held court with her bridesmaids and closest friends. The women, all cut from the same cloth of inherited privilege and carefully maintained beauty, discussed wedding plans with the intensity of military strategists planning a campaign. Victoria's voice dominated the conversation, detailing every aspect of what she declared would be the wedding of the century. The ceremony will be at St. Philip's, naturally, Victoria was explaining as Jess approached with a fresh bottle of champagne. We've reserved the entire church for the entire weekend. The reception will be here at the club, but we're having the ballroom completely redesigned. I simply cannot have my wedding reception in a space that looks like everyone else's boring parties. One of the bridesmaids, a redhead whose jewelry probably cost more than most people's cars, leaned forward with interest. What about the guest list? I heard you're expecting over 400 people. Victoria's smile took on a predatory quality as Jess began refilling the champagne flutes around the table. Oh, we're being very selective. Only the most important families, of course. We can't have just anyone in our wedding. It's important to maintain certain standards. Her pale blue eyes flicked toward Jess with undisguised disdain. Some people simply don't belong in our world, and it's crucial to remember that. Jess felt her cheeks warm, but kept her expression neutral as she continued pouring. She had heard variations of this sentiment countless times over the years, and while it still stung, she had developed a thick skin out of necessity. The goal was always the same: get through the shift, collect her tips, and move one step closer to her dreams. Everything else was just noise. The flowers alone are costing $60,000, Victoria continued, her voice growing louder as she warmed to her favorite topic. I've hired the best florist in the Southeast. Every arrangement will be a work of art. Of course, I had to fire the first 3 florists because they simply couldn't understand my vision. It's so difficult to find people who can execute elegance at this level. As Jess moved around the table, she accidentally bumped the back of Victoria's chair slightly while reaching to fill a glass at the far end. It was the slightest contact, barely enough to shift the chair an inch, but Victoria whirled around as if she had been physically assaulted. "Excuse me," Victoria snapped, her voice cutting through the ambient conversation like a blade. "Could you please be more careful? This dress is worth more than you make in a year, and I will not have it ruined by clumsy service." The women at the table fell silent, their eyes darting between Victoria and Jess with the hungry anticipation of spectators at a gladiator match. Jess felt the heat of embarrassment creep up her neck, but she maintained her professional composure. "I apologize, Miss Ashworth," Jess said quietly, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "It won't happen again." Victoria's laugh was sharp and cold as she turned back to her friends, but her voice remained loud enough for Jess and anyone else nearby to hear clearly. "You know, I suppose this is good practice for her," she said with mock thoughtfulness. "She'll probably be serving at her own wedding someday, if anyone would ever want someone so awkward and common. Though, I suppose people like that don't really have proper weddings, do they? More like courthouse ceremonies with cake from the grocery store." The bridesmaids giggled nervously, some looking uncomfortable with Victoria's cruelty but unwilling to challenge their friend. Jess felt her face burn with shame and anger, but years of experience had taught her that any response would only make the situation worse. She finished filling the glasses in silence, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. From across the room, Alexander Bennett had witnessed the entire exchange. He had been half listening to a conversation about golf handicaps when Victoria's voice cut through the ambient noise, drawing his attention. What he saw made his stomach turn with a mixture of disgust and embarrassment that settled like lead in his chest. This was the woman he was going to marry in 6 months. The woman who would bear his children and represent his family's name in society. Yet here she was, displaying a cruelty that went beyond mere snobbery into something truly ugly. Alexander excused himself from the group of men and made his way toward the bar, needing a stronger drink and a moment to process what he had just witnessed. As he waited for the bartender to pour him another whiskey, he found himself watching Jess as she continued her work with quiet dignity. There was something about the way she carried herself, the grace with which she handled Victoria's abuse, that struck him as fundamentally decent in a way that felt foreign in his current social circle. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow congratulations. Victoria continued to hold court, regaling anyone within earshot with increasingly elaborate details about her wedding plans. She spoke of custom gowns and imported flowers, of orchestras and celebrity chefs, painting a picture of excess that seemed designed more to impress than to celebrate love. Alexander found himself nodding at appropriate intervals, while his mind wandered to thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. Jess finished her shift near midnight, her feet aching from hours in dress shoes, and her mind exhausted from maintaining her professional facade. As she collected her things from the staff break room, she allowed herself a moment to feel the full weight of the evening's humiliation. Victoria's words echoed in her head, each syllable a reminder of the vast gulf between her world and the one she served. The worst part wasn't even the insult itself, but the casual way it had been delivered, as if Jess's feelings and dignity were so insignificant they didn't merit consideration. The parking lot was nearly empty by the time Jess made her way to her 10-year-old Honda Civic, its faded paint and numerous scratches, a stark contrast to the luxury vehicles that still dotted the club's valet area. As she sat in her car, waiting for the engine to warm up, she allowed herself a few minutes to dream about the day when she would never have to endure another evening like this one. Nursing school was only 18 months away if she could maintain her current savings rate, and then she would have a career that mattered, work that made a difference in people's lives. The next few days passed in their usual rhythm of work and study. Jess picked up shifts at 2 other restaurants to supplement her income from the country club, and spent her free time reviewing anatomy textbooks and practicing for her nursing school entrance exams. The engagement party became just another unpleasant memory, filed away with dozens of others. A reminder of why she was working so hard to change her circumstances. It was Thursday afternoon when Jess arrived at the country club for her regular shift. The staff break room was buzzing with gossip about the upcoming Cal Bennett Ashworth wedding, which had apparently been featured in the society pages of the Charleston newspaper. Several of her co-workers were discussing the article with a mixture of fascination and eye-rolling, sharing details about the estimated cost and the list of prominent guests expected to attend. "Did you see the part about the wedding cake?" asked Maria, one of the senior waitresses who had worked at the club for over 15 years. 12 tiers, and flown in from New York City. "The thing's going to cost more than my car." "Another server?" James shook his head with amusement. "I heard they're having the reception menu catered by that celebrity chef from Food Network. You know, the one with his own restaurant in New York. They're flying him down just for the wedding." Jess listened to the conversation while changing into her uniform, trying to feel appropriately impressed rather than nauseated by the excess. She understood that wealth allowed for certain luxuries, but there was something about the scale of Victoria's wedding that felt obscene, especially given the casual cruelty she had witnessed the other night. It seemed to represent everything that was wrong with a BASA system that allowed some people to spend more on flowers than others made in a year. Her shift that afternoon was relatively quiet, with only a small group hosting a business lunch in one of the private dining rooms. Jess appreciated the calm after the chaos of the engagement party, finding solace in the routine tasks of setting tables and polishing silverware. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself looking forward to the evening, when she could go home to her small apartment and lose herself in her textbooks. It was near the end of her shift when she discovered Dow, the ring. She had been clearing the last of her tables and preparing to count her tips when she noticed something unusual in her tip jar. A small glass container that she kept behind the bar where customers could discreetly leave additional gratuities. nestled among the usual baths. Collection of bills was a small black velvet box that definitely had not been there when she started her shift. Jess looked around the now empty dining room, wondering if someone had accidentally dropped the box or left it behind. Finding nothing else out of place, she carefully picked up the velvet container, surprised by its weight and the quality of the material. The box bore the logo of Henderson Jewelers, one of Charleston's most exclusive jewelry stores, and her heart began to race as she realized this was not some forgotten trinket. With trembling fingers, she opened the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring that took her breath away. The center stone was a brilliant round-cut diamond of at least 2 carats, set in platinum and surrounded by smaller diamonds that caught the light like tiny stars. Even with her limited knowledge of jewelry, Jess could tell this was an extremely valuable piece, probably worth more than she would make in several years. Tucked beneath the ring was a small card written in elegant handwriting that made her pulse quicken as she read the words. For someone who deserves a real love story, not a show. Your grace under pressure that night was more beautiful than any diamond. Some people are born with class. Others can only buy the appearance of it. You have something genuine that no amount of money can purchase. Wear this and remember that you are worthy of respect, kindness, and love. A friend who sees your true value. Jess read the note 3 times, her mind reeling with confusion and disbelief. Who can have left such an expensive gift, and why? The reference to that night suggested it was connected to the engagement party, but she couldn't imagine any of the wealthy guests caring enough about her humiliation to respond with such an extraordinary gesture. The handwriting was masculine and confident, written with what appeared to be an expensive pen on heavy cardstock that suggested education and refinement. Her first instinct was to turn the ring over to management, assuming it must be a mistake or some kind of elaborate prank. But something about the personal nature of the note gave her pause. The words were too specific, too thoughtful to be random. Someone had witnessed Victoria's cruelty and had been moved to respond in a way that was both generous and deeply personal. As she stood there holding the ring, Jess felt a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite process. Gratitude for the kindness of the gesture, warred with anxiety about accepting something so valuable from a stranger. There was also a deep curiosity about the identity of her mysterious benefactor, someone who had apparently seen past her uniform to recognize something worthy of such an extraordinary gift. The practical part of her mind immediately went to the financial implications. A ring of this quality could be sold to pay for nursing school, with money left over, potentially changing the trajectory of her entire life. But there was something about the note that suggested the gift was meant to be worn, not sold, a symbol of worth rather than a windfall. Jess carefully placed the ring back in its box and slipped it into her purse, her hands still shaking slightly from the shock of discovery. She finished her closing duties in a daze, her mind cycling through possibilities about who might have left such a gift. The obvious candidates were the wealthy guests from the engagement party, but most of them had barely acknowledged her existence, let alone witnessed her interaction with Victoria. That night, Jess sat in her small apartment, examining the ring under her desk lamp, marveling at the way the light fractured and danced through the perfectly cut stones. She had looked up Henderson Jewelers online and confirmed that rings of this quality typically sold for $30,000 to $40,000, an amount that represented more money than she had ever seen in one place. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each detail perfectly executed in a way that spoke to both exceptional skill and unlimited budget. She read the note again, searching for clues about the identity of her mysterious benefactor. The handwriting was educated and confident, suggesting someone comfortable with formal communication. The paper itself was expensive, the kind used for official correspondence by law firms or executive offices. Most telling was the phrase, "real love story, not a show," which suggested the writer had strong opinions about the engagement party, and perhaps about Victoria and Alexander's relationship specifically. Over the next several days, Jess found herself paying closer attention to the interactions she witnessed at the country club, searching for signs that might identify the person who had shown her such unexpected kindness. She studied the faces of the regular patrons, looking for some hint of recognition or special attention that might reveal her secret admirer. But the wealthy members continued to treat her with the same polite indifference they always had, offering no clues about who among them might harbor romantic feelings for a waitress. The ring remained hidden in her apartment, too valuable and conspicuous to wear to work, but too meaningful to simply put away and forget. Jess found herself taking it out in the evenings, slipping it onto her finger, and trying to imagine the kind of life where such gifts were commonplace. The weight of it on her hand felt foreign but not unpleasant, a constant reminder that someone, somewhere, believed she deserved beautiful things. It was nearly 2 weeks after discovering the ring that Jess received an unexpected phone call at work. The caller identified himself as Jonathan Henderson from Henderson Jewelers, and his voice carried an urgency that immediately put her on edge. "Miss Rodriguez," he said after she had confirmed her identity, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I have a rather delicate matter to discuss with you. It's regarding a piece of jewelry that may have come into your possession recently." Jess felt her heart skip a beat as she gripped the phone tighter. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said carefully, not wanting to admit to anything until she understood the situation better. "I believe you may have received a diamond ring from our store," Mr. Henderson continued, his tone diplomatic but firm. "A very valuable piece that was purchased under somewhat unusual circumstances. I wonder if we might arrange a time to speak privately about this matter." The implications of the call sent a chill through Jess's body. If the jeweler was calling her directly, it suggested that either the ring had been stolen or that someone was looking for it. Either possibility filled her with dread, as she imagined herself being accused of theft or being forced to return the only beautiful thing she had ever owned. "I think there may be some mistake," Jess said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know anything about any ring." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Mr. Henderson spoke again, his tone softer and more understanding. "Ms. Rodriguez, I want to assure you that you're not in any trouble. The ring was purchased legitimately, and the buyer specifically requested that it be given to you. However, there have been some developments that require us to discuss the circumstances of the gift. Would it be possible for you to come to the store this afternoon? I promise this won't take long, and I believe you'll find the conversation enlightening." Jess agreed to meet with the jeweler later that day, her mind racing with questions and fears about what she might learn. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of anxiety as she imagined various scenarios, each one worse than the last. By the time she arrived at Henderson Jewelers that afternoon, she had convinced herself that she was about to lose the ring and possibly face criminal charges for possessing stolen property. Henderson Jewelers occupied a corner building in Charleston's historic district, its understated elegance reflecting the kind of old money clientele it served. The interior was decorated in muted tones of cream and gold, with carefully lit display cases showcasing pieces that probably cost more than most people's houses. Mr. Henderson himself was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair, and the kind of refined manner that came from decades of dealing with the city's elite. He greeted Jess warmly and led her to a private office behind the main showroom, offering her tea and speaking in the careful tones of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. Once they were seated, he opened a file on his desk and regarded her with an expression that mixed sympathy with professional concern. "Miss Rodriguez," he began, "I want to start by assuring you that you have done nothing wrong. The ring you received was purchased legitimately by someone who specifically requested that it be given to you. However, the circumstances surrounding that purchase have become rather complicated." End quote. Jess nodded, not trusting herself to speak as she waited for him to continue. "The ring was purchased 3 weeks ago by Alexander Bennett," Mr. Henderson said, watching her face carefully for a reaction. "He paid cash and specifically requested that it be delivered to you anonymously. He also provided the note that accompanied the gift." The revelation hit Jess like a physical blow, leaving her momentarily breathless. Alexander Bennett, the groom from the engagement party, had been her mysterious benefactor. The man who was engaged to Victoria Ashworth, who had humiliated her so publicly, had somehow been moved to offer her such an extraordinary gesture of kindness and respect. "I don't understand," Jess managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would he do such a thing?" Mr. Henderson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I'm afraid I can't speak to his motivations, as he didn't share them with me. However, I can tell you that he seemed very certain about his decision and very specific about his instructions. He wanted you to have something beautiful, something that would remind you of your own worth. But he's engaged, Jess said, the full implications of the situation beginning to dawn on her. He's getting married to Victoria Ashworth. This ring, it's worth more than I make in a year. Why would he give something like this to a waitress he barely knows? That, Mr. Henderson said gently, is where the situation becomes complicated. You see, Miss Rodriguez, Mr. Bennett came to see me again yesterday. It seems there have been some significant changes in his personal circumstances. Jess felt her stomach drop as she waited for him to continue, dreading what she might hear next. Mr. Bennett has called off his engagement to Miss Ashworth, Mr. Henderson said quietly. Apparently, there were some fundamental differences in their values that he felt made marriage impossible. He wanted me to contact you because he has a proposition to make. The office seemed to spin around Jess as she tried to process this information. Alexander Bennett had broken his engagement, and somehow that was connected to the ring he had given her. The implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. What kind of proposition? She asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Mr. Henderson smiled for the first time since she had arrived. He would like to meet with you, if you're willing. He has some things he'd like to explain about why he gave you the ring and what it means to him. He asked me to tell you that he understands if you prefer not to see him, but he hopes you'll give him the chance to explain himself properly. Jess sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of a situation that seemed to belong in a fairy tale rather than her real life. A wealthy man had broken his engagement and wanted to meet with her, apparently because of some connection he felt after witnessing her humiliation at his own engagement party. It was the kind of scenario that existed only in movies and romance novels, not in the life of a waitress from a working-class family. I need some time to think about this, she said finally, her voice shaky with emotion. This is all very overwhelming. Of course, Mr. Henderson said kindly. Mr. Bennett said he would wait as long as necessary for your answer. He also wanted me to tell you that regardless of whether you choose to meet with him, the ring is yours to keep. He considers it a gift freely given, with no strings attached. As Jess left the jewelry store that afternoon, her mind was reeling with questions and possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The ring in her purse felt heavier now that she knew its true significance, a symbol not just of someone's generosity, but of a connection that had apparently been profound enough to change the course of a man's life. That evening, she called in sick to her shifts at the other restaurants and spent hours walking along the Charleston waterfront, trying to process everything she had learned. The historic city stretched out around her in all its antebellum beauty, but she barely noticed the familiar sights as she wrestled with the most important decision of her life. Alexander Bennett was everything she was not: wealthy, educated, connected to the kind of society that had always treated her as invisible. Yet he had apparently seen something in her that even she didn't recognize, something valuable enough to risk a marriage in a social position that most people would kill for. The question now was whether she had the courage to find out what that something might be. The next morning, Jess called Mr. Henderson and agreed to meet with Alexander Bennett. They arranged to meet that afternoon at a small cafe in the French Quarter. Neutral ground, where they could speak privately without the intrusion of either of their usual worlds. As she prepared for the meeting, Jess found herself slipping the diamond ring onto her finger for the first time, surprised by how natural it felt there. The cafe was exactly the kind of place she would have chosen herself, small and intimate with mismatched furniture and the smell of fresh coffee beans filling the air. Alexander was already there when she arrived, seated at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and an expression of nervous anticipation that made him seem younger than his 32 years. He stood as she approached, his movements uncertain, as if he wasn't sure of the proper protocol for such an unusual meeting. "Jess," he said, and the way he spoke her name, with a warmth and familiarity that surprised her, made her realize that this meeting had been as important to him as it was to her. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." They sat across from each other, the diamond ring catching the afternoon light streaming through the window between them. For a moment, neither spoke, both seemingly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the conversation they were about to have. "I owe you an explanation," Alexander said finally, his green eyes meeting hers directly for the first time. About the ring? About the note? About why I ended my engagement? About why meeting you changed everything? Jess listened as Alexander began to tell his story, starting with the night of the engagement party and the disgust he had felt watching Victoria's cruelty. But as he continued, the story became more complex and more personal than she had expected. He spoke about the pressure he had felt his entire life to marry appropriately, to choose a partner who would enhance his family's social standing rather than one who made him happy. "I've known Victoria since we were children," he said, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table between them. "Our families always assumed we would marry eventually, and it seemed like the logical choice. She was beautiful, well-connected, everything my parents wanted in a daughter-in-law, but I never really saw her clearly. Until that night at the party." He described watching Jess handle Victoria's abuse with grace and dignity, maintaining her professionalism even in the face of deliberate humiliation. "There was something about the way you carried yourself," he said. "Something genuine and strong that made everything else in that room seem artificial by comparison. I realized I had never seen Victoria show that kind of character, that kind of quiet strength." "But the ring, yes," Jess said, still struggling to understand the magnitude of his gesture. "Why give me something so valuable? You barely knew me." Alexander smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, the expression reached his eyes. "Because I wanted you to know that someone saw your worth, that someone recognized the kind of person you are beneath the uniform and the circumstances, and because I needed to do something meaningful, something that mattered more than appearances and expectations." As their conversation continued, Jess learned that Alexander's decision to end his engagement had been building for months, with the incident at the party serving as the final catalyst rather than the sole cause. He spoke about feeling trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt empty and meaningless on a personal level. The ring had been his way of acknowledging that there were more important things than social standing and family expectations. "I'm not asking for anything," he said as their conversation drew toward its natural conclusion. "I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated because of the gift. I just wanted you to know that you made a difference in someone's life, that your dignity and grace in a difficult moment inspired someone to make better choices." But as Jess looked across the table at this man who had risked everything to follow his conscience, she realized that she wanted to know him better. There was something about his quiet sincerity and his willingness to sacrifice security for authenticity that spoke to her own values and dreams. "What happens now?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. Alexander's smile widened, and she could see relief and hope mingling in his expression. "Now we get to find out," he said. "If you're willing." Their relationship developed slowly over the following months, built on conversations in coffee shops and long walks through Charleston's historic streets. Alexander was nothing like the entitled aristocrat Jess had expected, instead revealing himself to be thoughtful, surprisingly humble, and genuinely interested in her dreams and aspirations. He supported her nursing school plans, not just financially, but emotionally, encouraging her studies and celebrating her acceptance into the program. For her part, Jess discovered that wealth and privilege hadn't insulated Alexander from his own struggles with identity and purpose. His decision to break from family expectations had cost him relationships and business opportunities, but it had also freed him to pursue work that mattered to him personally. He began focusing his real estate business on affordable housing development, using his resources and connections to create opportunities for working families rather than just profit margins. Victoria's reaction to the broken engagement had been as dramatic and vindictive as Alexander had expected. She spread rumors throughout Charleston society about his mental stability and her own victimization, portraying herself as the innocent party abandoned by a man who had lost his mind. Some of their former friends chose sides, and Alexander found himself excluded from social circles that had once been central to his identity. But rather than feeling diminished by these losses, Alexander discovered a sense of freedom he had never experienced before. With Jess by his side, he began building a life based on personal values rather than social expectations, finding joy in simple pleasures that his previous lifestyle had never allowed him to appreciate. The diamond ring became a symbol of their unconventional beginning, but also of their shared commitment to authenticity over appearances. Jess wore it proudly, not as a display of wealth, but as a reminder of the moment when two people from different worlds found common ground in their shared values and mutual respect. 1 year after their first meeting at the cafe, Alexander proposed properly, not with another expensive ring, but with a simple band he had made himself in a jewelry-making class. He had taken to better understand the craft behind beautiful things. The gesture was perfectly him, thoughtful and personal rather than ostentatious and public. Their wedding was everything Victoria's would not have been, small and intimate, focused on the celebration of love rather than the display of wealth. They married in the garden behind Jess's childhood church, surrounded by family and the friends who had supported them through their unconventional courtship. The reception was held at the community center where Jess had volunteered during high school, with food provided by local restaurants and music from a friend's acoustic guitar rather than a full orchestra. Victoria did attend, uninvited, arriving in a designer gown that cost more than most people's cars and making a scene that became legendary in Charleston social circles. Her dramatic proclamation that Alexander would regret throwing away his future for a common waitress was captured on someone's phone and went viral on social media, cementing her reputation as the entitled socialite who lost her prince to the kind-hearted woman who served her champagne. But by then, Jess and Alexander were beyond caring about Victoria's opinions or the judgments of Charleston society. They had built something real together, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love rather than social convenience and family expectations. Jess completed nursing school with Alexander's support, graduating at the top of her class and accepting a position in the pediatric ward of Charleston's Children's Hospital. Her work with sick children became a source of deep fulfillment, providing the sense of purpose and meaning she had always sought. Alexander transformed his real estate business into a force for social good, developing affordable housing projects and using his wealth to address inequality rather than perpetuate it. 5 years after that night at the country club, Jess stood in the same ballroom where Victoria had humiliated her, but this time as an honored guest at a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. She was wearing the same diamond ring that had started their love story, but now it was accompanied by the simple wedding band Alexander had made with his own hands. The irony was not lost on her, that she was now technically part of the same social circle that had once treated her as invisible. But rather than feeling vindicated or superior, she felt a quiet satisfaction in using her position to advocate for the kinds of changes that would benefit people like her younger self. She and Alexander had established a scholarship fund for working students pursuing nursing degrees, ensuring that financial barriers wouldn't prevent others from achieving their dreams. As she moved through the elegant crowd that evening, Jess reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once served champagne to these same people now stood among them as an equal, not because she had changed who she was, but because someone had seen her true worth and helped her recognize it in herself. Victoria Ashworth, now Victoria Pemberton, after a hasty marriage to a banker from Atlanta, watched from across the room with barely concealed resentment. Her own life had not unfolded as she had planned, her second marriage proving to be more about financial security than passion, her social standing diminished by the scandal of her broken engagement and subsequent vindictive behavior. The irony that the common waitress she had mocked now commanded more respect in Charleston society than she did was a bitter pill that Victoria found impossible to swallow. But Jess felt no satisfaction in Victoria's diminished circumstances, only a kind of peaceful indifference that came from having found her true path in life. She had learned that real power came not from the ability to humiliate others, but from the capacity to lift them up, not from inherited privilege, but from earned respect and genuine contribution to the community. As the evening progressed, Jess found herself in conversation with Maria, the senior waitress who had worked at the country club for 15 years and who had witnessed her humiliation that night so long ago. Maria now worked part-time at the club while pursuing her own nursing degree through the scholarship program Jess and Alexander had established. "I never thought I'd see the day," Maria said with a warm smile as they stood together watching the elegant crowd. "That girl who served Victoria Ashworth with such grace that night, now she's Mrs. Alexander Bennett, And she's changing lives all over Charleston. Jess laughed softly, still sometimes surprised by the turns her life had taken. You know what the strangest part is? I'm still the same person I was that night. The only thing that changed was that someone helped me see myself differently. That's not true, Maria said gently. You always had that strength, that dignity. Alexander just had the wisdom to recognize it when others couldn't see past your uniform. Later that evening, as the fundraiser wound down and the last guests began to leave, Jess and Alexander found themselves alone in the same ballroom where their story had begun. The space looked different now, decorated for the charity event rather than an engagement party, but the memories of that transformative night hung in the air between them. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't given you that ring? Alexander asked as they stood together in the center of the dance floor, where Victoria had once held court. Jess considered the question seriously, thinking about all the different paths her life might have taken. I think we would have found each other eventually, she said finally. Maybe not in the same way, but I believe that people who are meant to be together find a way to connect, regardless of circumstances. Alexander pulled her closer, and they swayed together to the soft music still playing from the sound system. I used to think that night was about me saving you from Victoria's cruelty, he said. But I realize now that you saved me from a life that looked perfect but felt completely empty. We saved each other, Jess corrected gently. That's what real love does. As they danced in the quiet ballroom, Jess thought about the young woman she had been 5 years ago, working multiple jobs and dreaming of a different life. That woman could never have imagined that serving champagne at a wealthy engagement party would lead to finding true love and genuine purpose. She had been focused on changing her circumstances, never realizing that the most important changes would come from within. The diamond ring on her finger caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the walls just as it had that first night when Victoria had displayed it so proudly. But now the ring represented something entirely different. Not a symbol of wealth or status, but a reminder of the moment when kindness had triumphed over cruelty, when someone had chosen to see potential rather than all limitation. Outside, Charleston's historic streets were quiet in the late evening hour, the gas lamps casting gentle pools of light along the cobblestone paths where they had taken so many walks during their courtship. The city that had once seemed divided into separate worlds of haves and have-nots now felt unified to Jess, a place where she could move freely between all levels of society, respected for her work and valued for her contributions. Their children, when they came, would grow up understanding both sides of that divide. They would know the value of hard work and the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their station in life. They would learn that true worth came not from what you owned, but from how you treated others, not from where you started, but from what you chose to do with the opportunities you were given. As Jess and Alexander finally left the country club that night, walking hand in hand toward their car, Jess felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them together. The cruelty that had felt so devastating that night 5 years ago had ultimately led to the greatest gift of her life, not just Alexander's love, but the discovery of her own strength and worth. The woman who had once worried about serving at her own wedding had instead created a love story that would be remembered in Charleston for generations, not because of its extravagance, but because of its authenticity. She had learned that the most beautiful weddings weren't measured by their cost, but by the depth of feeling they celebrated, that the most valuable rings weren't necessarily the most expensive, but the ones given with the most love. Victoria's prediction that Jess would end up with a courthouse ceremony and grocery store cake had been laughably wrong, but even if it had been true, Jess now understood that it wouldn't have mattered. Love wasn't about the setting or the cost. It was about finding someone who saw your true value and chose to treasure it above all else. The ring that had started as an anonymous gift from a stranger had become a symbol of everything Jess had learned about love, respect, and self-worth. Every time she looked at it, she remembered not just the moment Alexander had chosen her over his predetermined path, but the moment she had chosen to believe she deserved something beautiful and real. Their love story had begun with an act of cruelty that revealed the best in both of them, his compassion and her dignity, combining to create something neither could have achieved alone. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes in life came not from dramatic gestures, but from quiet moments of recognition, when one person looked past surface appearances to see the true worth of another. As they drove through the quiet streets toward home, Jess reflected on how different her life looked now from what she had planned all those years ago. She had achieved her dream of becoming a nurse, but she had also discovered dreams she never knew she had. The joy of using privilege responsibly, the satisfaction of creating opportunities for others, the deep contentment that came from being truly known and loved for who she was. The fairy tale aspect of their story, the wealthy man rescuing the poor waitress, had captured the imagination of people who heard it, but Jess knew the reality was more complex and more beautiful than any simple narrative could capture. They had rescued each other, not from poverty or loneliness, but from lives that felt incomplete, from settling for less than they deserved, from the fear that real love and authentic happiness were impossible to find. Years later, when people asked Jess for the secret to their successful marriage, she would always return to the lessons of that first night. Treat everyone with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. Look for the best in people rather than focusing on their limitations. Have the courage to follow your heart, even when it leads you away from what others expect. And remember that the most valuable things in life, love, respect, kindness, cannot be bought but must be earned and freely given. The diamond ring continued to sparkle on her finger as they pulled into their driveway, a symbol not just of their love, but of the transformative power of seeing and being seen clearly. It reminded her daily that she was worthy of beautiful things, meaningful work, and genuine love. Lessons that no amount of education or success could have taught her as powerfully as one moment of unexpected kindness from a stranger who became the love of her life. The story that had begun with humiliation in a ballroom had become a testament to the possibility of change, growth, and second chances. It proved that love could indeed conquer the barriers of class and circumstance, but only when it was built on the foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to choose authenticity over appearance. And somewhere in Charleston, in the break rooms of restaurants and the dormitories of nursing schools, young women heard Jess's story and found the courage to believe that they too deserved love stories that honored their worth, that they too could find partners who would see past their circumstances to treasure the people they truly were. The ring that had begun as one man's gift to one woman had become a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever felt invisible, overlooked, or undervalued. The waitress who had served champagne with quiet dignity had become a nurse who healed children with the same grace. A wife who was cherished for her character rather than her connections, and a woman who used her platform to lift others up rather than looking down on them. Her story proved that the most profound revolutions begin not with grand gestures, but with small acts of recognition, respect, and love.